My name is Boris. I work at Facebook. I want to be clear, this is a personal project. This is not at all supported by Facebook. There's no team that's working on this. It's completely on my own time. So not official Facebook project. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm talking about Undux. So Undux is a new state management framework. It's an alternative to Redux, to Flux, MobX, all this kind of stuff. I've been working on it on the side for a while, and we rolled it out to a bunch of teams at Facebook over the last 6 months or so. So there's a bunch of teams using it. It seems to be working pretty well. So I wanted to talk about it a little bit. It's a little bit different than other state management frameworks in that it makes some very different trade-offs. So existing state management frameworks, a lot of them model state as trees. A lot of them have these concepts of actions, of selectors, of all this other stuff. Undux is a lot simpler. It takes away actions, it takes away reducers, it takes away all this stuff, and you end up with a very simple key value store. So the trade-off that it makes is everything becomes type safe, and everything becomes very, very easy to reason about. Okay, so let's start by talking about some of the problems. So some of the problems with Flux and Redux that I observed is there's a lot of boilerplate. So if you want to add an action, for example, you have to add an action function. You then add an action creator. You might have an action type if you're using a type system. You then have to add it to your reducer. And then finally, you read the state that you actually want from your store. So to add one field, you end up touching 5 different files. So that's kind of a lot to do. And I think that's actually, besides the boilerplate, besides the fact that you have to touch a bunch of files, is the fact that it's spread across a lot of files. If everything was in one file, that would be all right, because it's co-located. But I think because it's spread across a lot of files, it makes it very difficult to trace code. So if you've ever had to debug an action, or add an action, or remove an action, or anything like this, you're used to this. You have Nuclide or Sublime or whatever you're using open, and you're tracing it across 5 different tabs. So it's not a great experience. And again, there's reasons for this. There's reasons that the creators of these frameworks made these trade-offs. But today I'm going to argue that maybe there's a different set of trade-offs we can make, which results in a different framework, different experience. Does anyone here use a type system, like TypeScript or Flow or Reason? Okay, if you're not raising your hands, shame on you. Just kidding, but you really should try it, because it's pretty magical. But if you are using a type system and you're using something like Redux, it's very hard to type safely. And I'm sure everyone that raised their hand has noticed that if you have a type, you have to type 5 different places. You don't just have one thing typed and then it flows from there. You can't really use the type system to your advantage. You have to type it separately, so a lot of times you end up with objects or any's, something like that. So I think overall it makes easy things hard. Because really, fundamentally, what is this? What is the state in JavaScript? It's just, it's like a hash map, right? Fundamentally, the state, it's just a key value store, and it's in memory. It doesn't even persist. We don't have all the stuff that real databases have. Why is it so complicated? Okay, so how do we solve it? So with Undux, there's almost 0 boilerplate. So you can iterate really fast. It's really, really simple. You do everything right in your view. Do you guys remember when React came out? It was was anyone around when that happened? That was 5 years ago, 5 years and a few months, give or take. So when they announced React, when Jordan announced React at, I think it was JSConf, 5 years ago, he talked about it, and there was not a great reception. So he didn't get booed, but there wasn't thunderous applause. Which is kind of surprising. And then there's the story that he told. He went to a party after. There was an after party, and people were coming up to him and coming up to Tom, who helped with the presentation. They were like, man, did you see that framework that Facebook made? That sucks. They're going downhill. But look at where we are today. If you're making a front-end app anywhere in the world, you're going to be using React. That's the first framework that you're going to go to. And I think the reason that is because of collocation. I think fundamentally, that's the reason that React won. So before, it's not like React was the first MVC framework. There were other frameworks before. There was like Backbone, there was like Ext, there's all these other frameworks. But how they looked is you had a folder for models, a folder for views, and a folder for controllers, and everything was separate. So when you worked on a component, you had to touch 3 different files at least in different folders. So it was very, very hard to trace. The thing that React did is that it separated things by component, so by vertical instead of by horizontal. So you have a single file, and that has the M, the V, and the C. Everything's there. I think Chris also was talking about this yesterday morning. So that's what Undux does. So we co-locate. The other thing is 100% type safe. So you put your types in one place. It's flowed from there. We use some pretty advanced type system features. There's 2 languages in the world that can express the stuff that Undux does. It's TypeScript and Flow. There's no other languages that can express this, which is pretty cool. So we get to use our really cool type systems to their full advantage. So I think overall it makes hard things easy. So let's talk about the architecture a little bit. You guys have seen these like 3 state diagrams for Flux and for Redux. There's the store, there's the view, and then there's the reducer or the dispatcher, right? So with Undux, it's pretty similar, but it's just a store and a view. And we do have something like a reducer under the hood, but as a user, you don't have to care. It's all abstracted away for you. The really cool part of Undux, though, is effects. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So reactivity is really core to how Undux works. Okay, so the view, it's a React component, reads from the store, writes to the store. The store, you create it using this API called create connected store. And then effects, it's powered by RxJS. And it's a way to react to changes to specific fields. So if you ever used Angular and you use scope.watch, or if you've used object.observe or Rx observables, it's like that. Okay, you guys ready for some code? Yeah. So here's how we use it. Let's build Composer. Who's seen this before? Looks familiar? Okay, excellent. So we call this Composer. There's actually a very big team working on it, and it's crazy complicated, but for this example, we're gonna simplify it. So the first thing we do is we create a store. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna model 2 things on this. We're gonna model the text, so the text that you typed in, and then we're gonna model the next button. And that button only becomes enabled if you typed in some text. That's the 2 pieces of state. So what we do is we create a file called Composer Store. And it's .ts, but you could also do this in Flow or in just raw JavaScript. You can do it however you want. So what you do is you import this create connected store API from Undux. You declare a state type. So again, if you're not using a type system, you can ignore this, but you really should use a type system. It's pretty cool. You declare an initial state. So is next enabled, that's just the Boolean indicating whether the button is enabled, and then text is the stuff you typed in. And then you create a store. And when you create a store, it gives you back these 2 things. It gives you a container and a with store function. So if you've used something like Redux before, it should look pretty familiar. A container is just a provider, but we call it a container because people, I think, are more used to that name. And then there's with store, which you use to wrap components. Let's simplify that a little bit. Let's just export that thing so we don't have to destructure it here. If you're using a type system, there's 2 more exports you might have. There's store props, and these are the props of a React component that uses the store. And so what Undux does is it passes in a single prop called store of type store. And we apply the state type that we declared up here to that store type, and this creates a typed store. And then we export effects. Don't worry about this for now. We're going to talk about it in a few slides. Okay, so that's it. Now we have a store. Should be pretty familiar so far if you've used any kind of store API before. Cool. All right, so let's connect it. We have this composer. We're going to slice it up like this. So as UI people, we're all used to slicing stuff up. So we're going to start with a top-level composer component. And then in that, there's a sprat bar. That's all these little buttons here. There's the button. There's an editor. Inside of that, there's some stuff. So at the code level, it might look like this. And so what do? First thing, if you're using a type system, you add some props to it. So that's the store props that we declared earlier. These are just the type of the props that this React component accepts. And then we use the props. So to get the store, you just read it from props. And then to read a value from the store, you just do store.get. So store has the world's simplest API. There's 3 methods. It's .get, .set, and .on. So this is the first of them. This is .get. This is how you read a value from your store. Again, if you're using a type system, this is 100% type safe. So if you typed a different string, let's say test instead of text, you get a little red squiggly in your text editor right as you typed it. It's pretty cool, right? And again, there's 2 languages in the world that can actually express this. It's Flow and TypeScript. You can't do this in any other language. And then again, because this is statically typed, we know the return type of this is a string at compile time. So if you try to do something weird like store.getText times 2, it's a little red squiggly in your text editor right as you typed it. All right, to update the store, it's just store.set. This is the key, this is the value. And again, if you misspelled this, it's a little red squiggly right as you typed it. And value is known to be a string at compile time. So if you passed in something else, let's say you passed in a number or a nullable string or something, it's a little red squiggly right as you typed it. Can anyone figure out why we have this weird API? Why it's not just like text comma value? Yeah, so it's currying the function. And the reason the API is designed this way is because this is such a common pattern in React. If you're eagle-eyed, you'll notice we can simplify this. It's just like this. Pretty elegant, right? And then finally, we disable the button if isNextEnabled is false. Finally, let's hook this thing up. So we take the composer, and we wrap it with this withStore function that we declared when we created the store in composer store.ts. And this is it. So actually, as is, if you run this code, it works. If you type in the text, it'll update it in the store. As it updates in the store, it'll re-render your component. No more files. You don't need to write anything else, no actions, nothing like that. And it's completely type safe. OK, so the last part is effects. This is the really cool part. Has anyone here used RxJS or Most.js or any reactivity library before? OK, decent number of people. RxJS is super cool. I think over time we're going to use it more and more. Reactivity is generally a very new concept. It's made into programming the last 10 years or so, I think, in a real way. So I think it's just the beginning. But Undux uses RxJS under the hood. So what we do is we import the store effects type. This is the type we declared at the very bottom of Composer Store. And we declare one function called withEffects. You can call it anything, but by convention, it's withEffects. WithEffects is a function that takes a store and returns a store. Has anyone here used jQuery? It's okay, raise your hand, raise your hand. Yeah, it's a safe place. You can say it. So to listen to a field change on the store, it's just .on. And you do .on, .subscribe. It's a little bit different than jQuery or like node emitters, but it should feel very familiar. And again, this is completely type safe. So if you misspelled text, it's a little red squiggly right as you typed it, right in your text editor. And then here at compile time, we know that text is a string. All right, so what do? If text is an empty string, you set isNextEnabled to false. Otherwise, you set it to true. Finally, it's a function that takes a store, returns a store, so you return store. And if you're using a type system, you'd get a little red squiggly if you forgot to do that. Going back to the store, we import withEffects, and then we add it to this create connected store function. All right, we're almost done. There's one last step. So let's wrap Composer. So if you have like a top-level app component, the thing that uses Composer, let's say it looks like this. It's just a top-level component, just returns Composer. What you do is you have to wrap it with a container. It looks like this. And the container is the thing that actually creates the store instance. So we're using context API for that. And that's it. That works. There's no actions, there's no reducers, there's no dispatcher. There's nothing like that. This has some nice side effects. So the big idea is when you're looking at a component, you should understand exactly what's going on, right? So as an engineer, the question you're trying to answer most often is something like, what happens when I press this button? And with something like Redux, although Redux is so beautiful and so powerful, it's very hard to answer a question like that. But with Undux, it's very simple, because you just see a store.get, so you see exactly where in the store a field comes from, and a store.set, so you know exactly what happens when you press that button. So it's very easy to debug. And because set and get take strings, it's also very easy to search your code for all instances of this. So especially when you're working on a really big code base, this comes in handy. Okay, so to recap. Oh, give it a sec. There we go. The API is very simple. So it's .get to get a value, .set to update it, and .on to subscribe to it. Okay, let's look at a few before and afters. So with Flux, this is the architecture that you've seen. It's this tri-state architecture. So the store updates the view, sends an action to the dispatcher, updates the store. This is like the very classic one-way data flow. But in practice, it's a little bit more complicated. There's also containers. There's also action creators. There's also action types. So with Undux, we kill this. You can also think of it a different way. We don't entirely kill it. We just abstract it away. So it's still there. You just don't have to deal with it. As an engineer, you shouldn't have to write this stuff. The framework generates it for you. That also means that you can log anytime an update happens. So we have this logger utility. It takes like one line to implement it. It'll just log out every change. It looks like this. And of course, if you use Redux DevTools, it just works. Okay, so Redux before and after, very similar to Flux. We took that dispatcher, replaced it with a reducer. Looks like this. Again, in practice, it's a little bit more complicated. There's also containers. There's also action creators. There's also action types. As it grows, there's also thunks and selectors and epics or whatever else you might be using. And again, like these things have their role, and there could be value in designing systems like this. So it's not that one is better than another. They're just different trade-offs that you might want to make. And I think for me, the trade-off here is it's difficult to debug. It's difficult to make it type safe. So with Undux, we get rid of it. All right, this is the last part. Let's talk about reactivity. So for example, let's add a logger to Composer. So I'm sure a lot of you guys do this. You want to log a bunch of stuff, right? You want data. You want to know what your users do so that you can improve their experience. And so what you do is you can use effects for that. So we have this with effects function. With effects, again, it's a function that takes a store, returns a store, and it can do anything in between. It doesn't have to be one effect. It can be a bunch of different effects. And so we just add a second effect. And let's collapse this down because we're on a small screen. And let's say I'm using React.ga. So this is like the React wrapper for Google Analytics. You might be using some other analytics service. And so what we do is anytime that text changes, we log a Google Analytics event. This is cool, right? So like if you have a bunch of logs, you can put all of this into one file, and you can look at one file to see all the analytics events that you're sending over. There's a single source of truth. Let's say you want to slow down a little bit, you can debounce it. So remember, this is Undux is reactive. So store.on actually returns a reactive stream. It's an observable. So what you can do is you can pipe it. RxJS, very popular open source library. There's a ton of different operators that you can use. It's different ways to manipulate observable streams. There's like 100 operators. You're not going to use all of them. And they'll be crazy. But you use maybe 5, maybe 10. So debounce is a very common one. And this is something you might do. Google Analytics has some limit per application. There's some maximum number of logs that you can send. Let's say you're hitting that limit, you just debounce your stream. And what this does is now it will log text at most once every 100 milliseconds. How easy was that? Let's say you want to normalize a little bit. Let's say you're looking at your analytics, and you notice there's a lot of empty strings. There's a lot of null values. What do? Just filter it. Let's say you're looking at it again, and you see people typing the same thing, but in different cases, and you want to make everything lowercase. Any ideas how we might do that? Make everything lowercase? Yep, exactly. So just map it to lowercase. So again, there's a bunch of different operators you can use. This is just 3 of them. So that's it. Thank you.